God is our hope. As I said, it's our final sermon on Jeremiah. It takes place in the book of Lamentations, which is just after Jeremiah in the Old Testament. What's happened is Jeremiah was walking through the devastated city of Jerusalem. There was destruction everywhere. The invading Babylonians, as I say, had devastated Jerusalem because the people of Judah had ignored Jeremiah and had forsaken God. And at the moment he writes this, because we see in Lamentations, and I said this earlier on in one of the weeks that we did, a lament is a prayer. It's a complaint. It expresses sorrow, pain, or confusion. It was very common in the Old Testament as someone expressed deep regret or was upset. And so this is what's happened in the first two chapters of Lamentations. That Jeremiah has been complaining, he's been sharing his heartbreak, his sorrow, everything that's happened and stuff as he expresses this. And I said in the week that we did this, because it's important for us to understand this, because sometimes we don't always understand everything that happens in life. We don't always get the answers we want from God. Sometimes we just don't know. And I made this point, which is so important, that you can voice a lament, but you mustn't live in a lament. Which means you can voice a complaint, but you can't just live complaining. You know, some people you talk to, they just complain about everything. It's just complaining after complaining after complaining and stuff. There's nothing wrong with having a complaint. Even coming to God and sharing some of the stuff that you don't understand, that you don't know what's going on, why stuff happens and stuff. There's nothing wrong with voicing that. You can't live there. You can't live there because it's just negativity all of the time. It's just complaining all of the time. And you know, it's like the more you complain, you'll not get the answers because you complain more. It's as simple as that. If you just moan about it, you'll not get the answer any sooner. It'll not come any quicker. So it's important for us to understand you can voice a lament, but you mustn't live in a lament. The problem is with Jeremiah here, though he is the man of God with the message of God, he simply becomes depressed when he looks around at the situation. His city, the message has been given for so long, has come to pass because the people have just ignored God's offer of a second chance. And so he's looked at this situation and he just feels hopeless. And I'm sure you'll relate to that tonight. At times in our lives when we feel hopeless. Not only is Jeremiah hopeless, he's homeless as well. There's nowhere to live. It's just rubble everywhere, just destruction everywhere. He looks to his circumstances, to his physical condition. But we understand that whenever you look to sort of those physical events and stuff around you, when you look to yourself, you never get the answer to your problems. You have to look to somebody else, don't you? Somebody that is bigger than you and your circumstances. And for the first two chapters of Lamentations, Jeremiah's been speaking about the calamity, the destruction that's happened. It's evident in his words. But here is the example of a man who simply is voicing his complaint, but he can't live in it. It's got to be something now that breaks the back of this for him. And these are the words that we see that I've already read in these 5 verses in Lamentations 3. He stops. He says, "This I recall to my mind, this I remember. Therefore I have hope. Through the Lord's mercies we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should hope and wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord." This is his point, his corner that he turns in this book. He's had his complaint. He's asked the questions. He knew that this was going to happen because God always keeps his promises. We have to accept that the whole book of Jeremiah is God telling the people, here is a second chance. Here was a second chance. I mean, Jeremiah preaches for between 40 to 50 years. They didn't take any notice of him. and stuff. And so he gets to this point in the first couple of chapters here, up to this point, but then suddenly the brakes go on. He stops and he says, "This I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope." Hope's a powerful thing, isn't it? I mean, hope is a powerful thing. I mean, hope is a great word. It's so good we called our church after it. He said, hope is just this powerful word that you need in the circumstances and your situations that you face in life, particularly when they feel hopeless. You're looking for something that is hopeful, that gives you hope. And so therefore, this is what Jeremiah suddenly stops and he recalls, he brings this to mind and he remembers. Now, we know the misery of God's people had come because they would not truly seek God and wait for him. They rejected and rebelled for generations. We've said that. They've been told, here is a second chance they didn't want to. But suddenly, now they want rescued. Now the destruction has come. Now the calamity and the devastation has come. They want rescued. Where is the answer? And so Jeremiah's brought them this message of judgment, but then he brings them this message of hope. Because it tells us, he said, "This I recall to mind, therefore I have hope." He remembers. This is not the power of positive thinking. He's not sitting down in a dark room, focusing on a light in the corner. That's not that. That's not the power of positive thinking that Jeremiah is talking about. He's talking about remembering God's faithfulness, the hope that only comes from God. What does he remember? Well, it tells us, doesn't it? Through the Lord's mercies we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Just in that one verse there, it tells us what happens, what he's remembering. God's mercies, we're not consumed. You know what? He's still alive. Where there is breath in our lungs, there is still hope. Turn to the person next to you and just check that they're still breathing. There's breath in their lungs. Looking down from up here, I'm not quite sure with some of you. Okay, look, check. They're not consumed because while there's breath in your lungs, while you're alive, there's hope. And he says, we're not consumed, we're not destroyed. It is not the end. That's what he's really saying. It is not the end. It hasn't finished. We are not consumed. And he tells us why. He says, because God's compassions fail not. Even though they have made all the wrong choices, even though when presented with a second chance from God, he said they've ignored him and they've rebelled against him and they've said, we don't want it. God still declares, I'm compassionate. The judgment and the punishment has to come. But no avoidance of that has to come. But God says, my compassions fail not. And when we feel like they run out at the end of one day, he just adds this in, doesn't he? He says, they are new every morning. Every morning you get up. Every one of us tonight will go to bed. You might not sleep very well. You might sleep really well. But we'll wake up in the morning and it will be a new day. And it says, what's new every morning? His compassion. And because of that, he says, great is your faithfulness. That's what Jeremiah remembers today. That's what he recalls to mind. That's not positive thinking. He's standing on the belief of what he knows about God. This is a step of faith that he's taken. This is why he can have hope. He's reminded in the midst of the carnage, and his own anguish, he finds hope in this, that God is still in control. He says, we can look, I say watch the news today. Nobody wants to watch the news today. But when you do watch the news today, it says, be reminded God is still in control. He's not relinquished his authority, just because there's bad stuff happening. There's always been bad stuff happening. God has not given up his authority. He's not, the anguish and the carnage and the destruction there is around the world. And, we're not getting into all of who's to blame, who's at fault on that, because we believe in something bigger than that God is still in control. And so we have hope. And so in the midst of this, restoration of the city will happen. The people will have the opportunity to repent, to come back to him. God always gives people a second chance. The cross is the ultimate picture of the second chance that God gives to people, isn't it? That's the picture. The second chance, third chance, fourth chance. He continues to give chance after chance after chance. His compassion fails not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. And Jeremiah felt it was useful to remember it, to understand it for what it was and not to pretend it wasn't there. So he didn't think to himself, well, if I throw on a worship song here or pretend none of this is happening, and stuff. He's not doing that. He's not pretending the stuff isn't happening. There is trials, there is trouble, there is difficult circumstances, there is carnage, there is anguish, there's stuff going on in people's lives. We don't have God at our side to pretend it's not there. We have God at our side to lead us through it, to know that there is always hope. And you see, everything previous in Lamentations was deep in despair. The misery was by no means over. Seeking God again would bring renewed expression of his goodness. We see in the preceding verses, there was a bitterness of complaint. Why has this happened? There was a bitterness of adversity. Why has this happened? It's not our fault. Why did God not say something to us? Well, God did say something to them, but the people lost hope because it wasn't the message that they wanted to hear. And here we find that Jeremiah comes and he does something. He humbles himself under the mighty hand of God. And he understands, and we can relate to this tonight, regardless of what it is that we're going through, that we understand that God is in control. And that causes a revival of us personally. That's where the hope comes in, that we can have hope. We recall that to mind because God is in control. The situations we face are not in control. Other people are not in control. What we watch on the news is not in control. God is in control. And against all the despair, Jeremiah proclaimed to himself and all the others the goodness of hope and patient seeking of God. And he tells them, listen, wait upon God. When we talk about waiting, we think it's that thing where we're waiting for something to happen. The biblical meaning of the word waiting was with an expectation. There was a part for the people to play as they waited. They had to expect, they had to do as much as they could do. It wasn't a case of just sitting there and waiting for something to drop into their lap. We're told what they needed to do. They needed to seek God again. That would be the answer. That would be what would bring them back home. And so Jeremiah gets his comfort here. He seems to say this. And bad as my case is, it might have been worse. I might have been consumed. How could it have been worse? Well, he could have died. Could have been the end. But while there's breath in his lungs, it's not the end, because the Lord's compassion fails not. So against all this despair, Jeremiah proclaims this to himself first. Before he says anything to anybody else, he says, this I recall to mind. This I speak to myself, and therefore I have hope. He says that's the first person you need to speak to often, not everybody else. Therefore I have hope, not therefore they have hope or you have hope. He says, therefore I have hope by what I remember about God's goodness, by God's mercy, by God's compassion. And this is just one of the things that Jeremiah remembered. He remembered that as beat down and defeated as the people were, it was not completely over, because God was in control. God was the one that was still, he had left a group of people behind. The biblical word for that is a remnant. But more importantly, he left them with a promise of restoration, that he was saying, listen, this is bad now, but wait to see what I'm going to do. And that's what God does. Why does he do that? Because wherever God leaves life, he leaves hope. And in this magnificent expression of faith, the writer looks to the distant future with renewed hope. His hope is just renewed as he speaks it to himself. He knew that there was nothing else he could have. What alternative was there for him other than to find his answer in God? By having hope, by recalling that to mind and remembering it. And because God lives, then hope lives. Because that only works when we find our hope in God. When we find our hope in God. And Jeremiah does three things that helps us here. in the verses. The first one is this. He fixes on God's faithfulness. He is more powerful than the circumstances or situations you're facing tonight. You know how I know God is faithful today? Because he's faithful yesterday. Do you know how I know he's faithful tomorrow? But because he's been faithful today. It's almost like a building up of that account, knowing because God has been faithful, then we know that we can trust him. We know that we can fix our eyes on God's faithfulness. The second thing that he does, he focuses on God's nature. God is full of mercy and compassion. Even though the people have rejected him, even though they have turned down his second chance, even though they've taken no notice of Jeremiah's message and stuff, we know that God is still full of mercy and full of compassion. He says, again, it's a picture of the cross, isn't it? Oh, I mean, it wasn't, if at any point the cross was something we could earn, it would have been worthless. It would have been pointless. But because the cross is nothing that we can earn, we see a picture of God's mercy and grace that we just simply don't deserve, because it's his nature to call us home, to want to have a relationship with you and me so we can worship him. So the second thing that Jeremiah does is he focuses on God's nature. And then the third thing, he dwells on God's plan. God has already made a promise to them. We spoke about it one night when we spoke about Jeremiah 29. And when he said, for I know the plans I have for you, plans to give you a hope and a future. And when God speaks words like that, it has to pass. It has to come about. There's no, well, it just depends and stuff. God has said it. We can believe it. We can stand on the promise of it because it's God's plan. So in the middle of all the carnage and the anguish and the destruction and everything else going on, they can dwell on the plan that God has, that he still has a hope and a future for them. And if I apply that to us as people, well, we can look at it, and you could be in church tonight, and you can say to yourself, man, my life is completely messed up. I've failed, I've made mistakes, I've quit, I've shown my weaknesses, I've done things wrong, I've hit rock bottom. You could give me all of these stories, but the truth of it is this: God still has a plan for your life. He still has hope for you. He still has a future for you this evening. And, and you may look at it and say, but I've got nothing to offer you. You're right, you don't have anything to offer. That's why we just come to God as we are and surrender ourselves to him, because his plan for our lives is much better than the plan that we have for our lives, because the plan that we have for our lives ends in disaster and ends in trouble and ends in the sort of carnage and anguish that we're talking about and stuff. That God gives people a hope and a future. It's the good news of the gospel that gives people a hope and a future, that nobody is too far from God. Nobody is too far from God. There isn't anybody that God didn't send his son Jesus to the cross for. And it was his plan. And each dawning day gives mankind hope in this fresh mercy and compassion from God. We need a constant supply, don't we? And no matter how bad the past day was, God's people can look to the new morning with faith and hope. Even in their catastrophe, God was faithful. He faithfully announced his judgments and performed them. He had to do that. We can't get round that. We're not trying to get round it. We've explained all of that. The people ignored it. He announced his judgments and performed them. But God would prove to be just as faithful in his promised restoration. Which is amazing, isn't it? He's not rejecting them. He's not turning them away. And sometimes people, you sit and talk to them and say, there's not a place for me with God. I'm like, there is. He doesn't reject anybody. He turns nobody away. If you come to God in full surrender and humility, he doesn't turn anybody away. And so he restores each and every person that comes to him, that seeks him. And Jeremiah was suddenly drawn back into this living fellowship with this faithful God that he's spoken of so many times. And, you know, there's often times when the only thing a sufferer can do is wait. But waiting is good with God because it's something that's worth waiting for as he begins to speak of the mercy and the compassion. And, you know, we often need to recall to our minds who God is and what God has done already. God is always faithful to us. No matter where we are in life, no matter what our circumstances, God can be trusted. If you ever want to prove something is true, you have to submit the evidence, don't you? That God, so everything we say about God, we can argue, well, is it true or is it not true? Well, I can present every argument that there is. Well, is God faithful to us? Well, absolutely. Let's show you the evidence even from this story, that even though the people failed, were judged and punished, God still wanted to restore them, give them a hope and a future. That's the evidence. God is true to his name. God is true to his character. And God is true to his word. His faithfulness means, because he is the truth, everything he says and does is certain. And tonight your situation may seem hopeless. There's nothing wrong with reminding God about it. 2 verses before the opening passage, the verse that we read tonight, Jeremiah says, I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. In one verse there, he's got 4 complaints. Jeremiah reminds him, God, of his situation in life. Because he says this, God, you need to remember my situation. I don't have a place to live. My life is miserable. I'm going through a rough time. Have been for some time now. I'm asking you, God, to remember what has happened to me. Those are the words he's spoken. And often with prayer, when we come and pray, this is so true. Prayer is reminding God of the situations in your life, but then declaring your faith and hope in him. That's prayer. Prayer is just, we know God already knows. We're not surprised by what we say about the stuff that's going on in our life. But I think he likes us to express it. But he doesn't just like us to express it as a complaint, as a moan, as a lament. What he likes us to do is say, God, here's my situation. Listen, I'm hopeless and I'm homeless and I'm in despair. I've got nowhere to live. But God, I declare my faith and my hope in you, that you are the answer to all of those situations that I am facing. That's true prayer. That's real prayer. That's prayer that says, you know what? I have no answers in myself. I can't do it myself. There isn't anything within me that can answer the situations in my life. But when I declare the hope and the faith that I have in God, it's that gets recalled to mind. And therefore I have hope that the God of the universe is on my side, that the God of the universe sent his son Jesus to die for me because he loved me, that the God of the universe has forgiven all of my sin because of the price that was paid on the cross by his son, Jesus Christ. And you see, when we look at this, we come and we see that Jeremiah, as we come to the final thought here, he understands that God is always faithful to him. And we say it to us, no matter what circumstance tonight we face, God can be trusted. You can have hope tonight. Speak that faith to yourself. Recall it to your mind and remember it in those situations that you feel are hopeless, because God is faithful in keeping every promise he has ever made. One of my favorite verses in the Bible is Hebrews 10, verse 23. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. It's all about him. He who promised is faithful. It doesn't say, but me who promised is faithful, because I'm not. I got to look bigger than me towards a God that has made the promises, that he is faithful, and I can have a hope in him this evening. He not only advances and confirms what is true, his faithfulness abides in his promise. He says what he means, and he means what he says. To finish with this thought, because he lives tonight, we can have hope. And if nothing else this evening, you can have hope tonight. Not hope that's just sort of some power out there. Hope in God. This you can recall to your mind tonight in your situations, that because he lives, that you can have hope tonight. You can recall it to your mind and remember his faithfulness from yesterday to today into tomorrow. Let's take a moment to pray. Father God, we thank you this evening as we're here in church. Father, you know every circumstance and situation of every person that's in here tonight. God, you know where there is a sense of hopelessness, but you can bring hope. But we know, Lord, where there is a sense that people are looking for answers, well, you can be the answer. So God, whatever need people have tonight, you are the one that meets that need. And we just thank you for that tonight. And we pray as we conclude just this sermon series on Jeremiah, we finish with his thought on hope. There's nothing more powerful. We can have hope. You have promised them a hope. You have promised us a hope and a future. And we fix our eyes on your faithfulness this evening. You do not let us go. You do not abandon us. And for that this evening, Father, we say thank you in Jesus' name.